continues to be, right? Keeping It Real with Alexander Garrett. Once again, I wrote a Medium article this weekend about how we have to do more than thoughts and prayers. We have to add the words for change. Thoughts and prayers for change. But of course, the left doesn't even want to do thoughts and prayers anymore. It's all crazy and confusing because Ed Delgado, you're a podcaster as well. You're on the Caramel Conservative. Welcome, by the way, to the first time on Keeping It Real with Alexander Garrett.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for having me, Alex. I really appreciate that, my friend.
But the confusion truly is the mixed messages we're getting from everybody. But let me play you this soundbite. If you didn't hear it today, I thought this was the strongest statement by our president, no less, of the whole tragedy.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul.
Now, Ed, I didn't hear anybody else talk like that over the weekend. Did you?
No, everything that came across, especially from, your alphabet soup conglomerates, was just pointing the finger that Trump has to take blame, that it's his vitriol and his rhetoric. It was not, let's unify together. Nobody said anything remotely close to that.
And, it's interesting because they all said he was hatred, but he came out as the most unhateful person of all of them. I thought that was kind of ironic, but it's presidential at the same time.
Well, it's kind of funny when you think about it because President Trump often gets accused of sounding unpresidential. And I can't help but appreciate the irony in this, in that how is anything he's doing unpresidential? He's the president. Therefore, anything he does, whether he talks raw and kind of in your face and drops a four-letter word, or he gives a speech like he did today, this is presidential. And what he did today, I think, was he showed a level of humbleness and sadness that was appropriate for the occasion. And I think it really should have shut the critics down that said over the weekend that he was nowhere to be seen. Well, nobody knows, it's kind of like when you see a duck swimming. The duck is real calm on the surface, but you don't see them paddling underneath the water, keeping them afloat.
Right. And, Obama, just to compare, not to compare, but just say, where was he? He actually did speeches about the same time, 2 or 3 days after an attack happened. But I always thought his speeches weren't as strong as Trump was today. Now, there was another thing trending on social media. Caramel Conservatives is where you're at. We'll get to that in a second. But one other thing on this, there was another thing trending where, that someone says in the crowd, why don't we shoot them in El Paso? And he shook his head and he said, he kind of condemned it then, even though people said he didn't. He didn't really like the comment that was said at that rally. I don't know if you remember that moment at all.
I don't remember the moment itself, but I can't, who was it? Julian Castro that said it was the shooter was the only person to blame. And for Democrats in particular, they get these moments of lucidity where they say something. And I think for us on the right, oftentimes we get caught off guard when somebody says something off the wall, like, somebody shoot them. And we just kind of cringe. And I'm a little familiar with what you're talking about. I didn't get to hear the clip. I got to see part of the video. And you look at the president's face. Obviously, he wasn't thrilled about hearing that.
He wasn't at all.
So, right. So, I think we fall into this reactionary category instead of just calling it out right there on the spot. And I think that was one of the very few times that the president didn't call someone out on the spot like he normally does.
And so, with that, what is the Caramel Conservative's perspective on this? Talk about that podcast as well, but what are you guys talking about on the Caramel Conservative today following a tragic weekend?
Well, what we do is, just the overall show is just kind of a perspective from, and I'm a recovering liberal, back in my youth. What's that saying that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart? If you're not a conservative as you get older, you have no brain. I like to think I've kind of grown a little bit over the years, but I'm just an average guy. There's really nothing special about me. I'm a military brat. I'm a veteran. I did my service like hundreds of thousands of other people, but I'm a normal, average, everyday person. I just happen to be a little over opinionated. So put myself onto a podcast, and here we go. And it comes from a right-of-center perspective, from a Hispanic America's point of view. Because oftentimes I think we get so lumped into this idea that if you're brown or you're black, that you have to have this monolithic line of thinking, which falls in line with, being liberal. And if you don't toe the line, then all of a sudden you're a sellout. You're an Uncle Tom. Well, a lot of us, we don't need people to speak for us. We can do it for ourselves. And probably one of the biggest messages I want to drive home to a lot of folks is that you are not alone. There are others out here, whether it's yourself, whether it's me. And, however you come about to learning,
Sure.
That's the way to do it, And I think there's so many takeaways that could have happened from this particular weekend. The president talked about it. The left even talked about it indirectly, although they were, not indirectly, I think they were misguided in what they were talking about. Because oftentimes, and I say this a lot, the left is about projection. They're projecting that the president is speaking about hate and he's dividing people. Well, that's a lot of their shtick right there. Where the president talked about wanting to defeat hate and unifying people. He's actually going out here and showing us the way. Whereas all the left are doing is using this for cheap, points to get the nomination.
And, you had a great observation in our conversation off air that they were wasting no time. Nowadays, they don't waste any time pointing a finger instead of just letting the moment happen. Yes, offering thoughts and prayers. But firstly, doing something that I didn't see many people do. A tweet started trending about the El Paso PD saying, hey, if you're around, give some blood to these victims. Nobody really circulated that, but they should have, because that's how change happens. The first thing is, how do we get down there and support? And if we can't physically be there, maybe there is an outlet on Twitter. But I didn't see, the candidates for 2020 sharing that. I mean, I didn't see anybody on the liberal side sharing that, and that was kind of disheartening to me.
Well, and like I said, I think what they were doing is they were going for the cheap political points, because it's very easy to want to blame somebody. And for somebody whose whole career is blaming the right, well, this was kind of easy pickings, low-hanging fruit for them. And all it really was is tantamount to a bunch of sound bites for them that they may or may not be able to use in a future commercial. But it didn't serve the general welfare. It didn't serve the general good. They would have been wise to just speak on, the tragedy, say how terrible it was, because it's almost like it's obligatory for any major political figure to do that.
Sure.
But I think if you don't do that, you're missing the boat there. But at the same time, they could have used their platform to galvanize people together and say, you know what, we can wait till Monday or Tuesday before we start slinging arrows and rocks at each other. Until then, let's make sure that we help these people that have lost loved ones, that have been injured, that were in the vicinity, all of these traumatized people.
Yeah,
we didn't want to do that.
No one talked about that.
Right. Why do that when you can score cheap political points on, and I don't want to sound so negative about this, but there are so many people that buy into just the bites.
Yep.
And then that's even just as tragic.
Well, look at what happened. They set up TV cameras in front of Beto O'Rourke, who, as much as what he said, to his credit, he did fly back to El Paso. I would like our mayor, when a blackout happens or something, to fly back to New York, but I don't think I'll ever see that. So I'm a bit envious I have someone down in Texas, though we might disagree. At least he was on the ground, so I'll give him that little credit. But look how quickly they got cameras to his face. I mean, they didn't waste any time getting to Beto O'Rourke.
Well, Beto is there, is a little celebrity, and he's the, what's that meme that has circulated around? He's Obama vanilla version, and he's very charismatic when he speaks from time to time. So, he has and he's got the background as far as, going up against Ted Cruz, even though he lost, but it was enough to give him some credibility. So all he has to do is make a phone call, and boom, cameras are there. And I hate to make it, when I say, Obama, vanilla, because it almost sounds like I'm playing into the identity politics. But this is the guy who bills himself as Beto in order to try to appeal to Hispanic voters.
Right. True.
So this identity politic thing that, the left has done all too often, it does swing both ways. And my frustration with it becomes when those of us on the right, we're not willing to swing it back at them.
Never.
And it's always one of those things. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's always like we're just conservative. I don't consider myself a conservative or a Democrat. I'm just common sense. But typically these days, common sense is conservative. That's just the reality. But the conservative party, the GOP, stays in their corner and doesn't hit back, which is why they were so afraid of Trump to begin with, because he hits back and he hasn't inspired any of his, maybe Lindsey Graham for sure, but he hasn't inspired many others in Washington to hit back. And they have the R next to him,
Well, and that's always been the problem, and to a certain degree, I completely understand it because, hey, we want to be above the fray. We want to show that we're better than that. Hey, you know what? I get that. But if you're being better than that, being above the fray, not willing to go into the mud, has not yielded you the desired results in over 50, 60 years, then clearly you're doing something wrong. So when an individual like Beto O'Rourke, like say, snaps his fingers and he can get the cameras down there and he can go ahead and say the things that he says and the media eats it up and he does it with impunity, clearly he's doing something right. Now if those of us on the right could actually take a note on that page, on that book,
right?
Well, maybe we might actually be able to make some strides there too.
Talking with Ed Delgado, the Caramel Conservative. He has a podcast called That, which I guess you can pick up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much anywhere, right, Ed?
Like that, yes, sir.
It's pretty nice to see what your message can do when it's just not even the person behind it, but the message gets out to these outlets. It's kind of rewarding because I'm on all these outlets as well, and it's like, wow, the message is being sent. And the reason why we can't stay quiet is because the left will overpower us with voice and with action, and so the few that do speak out, I think, are doing a good duty.
Well, and I think it's imperative that shows, like yours and mine and a lot of the other ones, like you said, it's a duty. But I also believe at the same time that the left they've mastered bastardizing the English language. They've managed to take words like ally and, what's the other word? They make up words as well, too. I mean, up until a couple of years ago, I had no idea what a cisgender was. It was like, wow, so this is a new one. But without things like these, conservative podcasts, without having, the blogosphere out there, we end up losing the battle on the language front alone. We don't have anything to counter back to unless individuals take up, a simple mic, get yourself out there. And like I said, I'm another guy. I got a 9-to-5. I do what I got to do out here. I take care of my family, pay my taxes, take my trash out.
Now
anyone else does.
You're saying out here, he's actually from Wisconsin. I believe he's at Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Is that right?
Just west of Oshkosh, about a half hour there. So I'm in the middle of nowhere. Good times.
I'm lucky you got service today, to be honest with you. But did Milwaukee turn too liberal for you? I know you also serve, and thank you for your service to this country. But when you came back and you saw Milwaukee start to change, that must have really turned you off because you were there for a while, were you not?
On and off over the years. And I think for me and my family, we saw a lot of things changing, especially from, I want to say, 2009 forward. Crime started getting more rampant. The public school systems were just abysmal. The liberal politicians, I mean, there's a large conservative conglomerate there in Milwaukee, but the problem is drowned out by the even larger liberal presence there. So at that particular point, as much as I love the city of Milwaukee and what it once was, I had to come to grips with the fact that that's not what it is anymore. So we kind of had to make a calculated decision on what was going to be best for the family. Where do we want the children to come up on, and the values that we want them to have.
Sure.
So leaving the inner city was probably one of the smarter things to do. Now, granted, there's certain experiences in the inner city that you don't get out in rural areas, but that also works the other way as well. And I think what it is too is that when we go to smaller communities, there's more of a sense of just that very word, community. And that's kind of environment that I personally want to be in, that I want my children to be a part of, where people know each other. You want privacy, close the door, and there you go.
And you don't have politicians saying, hey, open the door. And you don't have politicians say, hey, open the door for these strangers that you don't even know. I mean, that's what's going on in our city right now, in our cities, I should say, across the country.
Well, and I think that's another thing that actually scares the hell out of me when you think about it, because you take a look at places like San Francisco, Oakland, Milwaukee, probably even New York. I saw this in Chicago by Midway International Airport. There are people living under highway overpasses. I saw there was one time I went down there last year, and I swear to God, this individual looked like they had an apartment. I mean, literally curtains, sectioned off rooms and everything under an overpass. And I know that can't lead to any type of sanitary conditions. It's not conducive to a business environment, and it's darn sure not safe for any kids or anyone else to be walking around under. And until people in major cities actually do something to take hold of this and actually solve this issue, because there's always going to be a homeless issue, but you don't want to encourage it and have tent cities popping up, and then you wonder why you have health condition issues there.
Right, and then when you take away the quality of life crimes, and that makes it even worse in these cities. So I applaud you for moving out. You sound like you love it in the country, but I got to ask you, are you still a Brewer fan? Has that Brewer Packer, even in the country, are you still a sports fan? Have you lost touch with sports or not?
See, I'm not a big sports fan in general, and especially when it comes to football, because Colin Kaepernick kind of killed it for me. 22 millionaires running out there and then crying about something just kind of ruined it for me. But got to keep in mind, I live in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, Green Bay Packer football, that's not just a sport. It's pretty close to being a religion up here. So, yeah, we do keep an eye on the Packers and stuff. Brewers, whenever they're hot, everybody and their brother watches it. It's, the only thing I think that's not really too big up here is the Bucks. But
that's funny because they were number one in the whole Eastern Division last year. So that's kind of funny that they're the least paid attention to while they're making moves. And of course, the Packers now have a new coach, I think, because McCarthy was fired after that whole disaster. Mm-hmm. So I've always liked Milwaukee. I like Yelich. I mean, I went to see him at Citi Field, hit a homer out of his Citi Field as usual. So. And I've been in Milwaukee in 2005. That was a fun experience. Went to Humboldt Park and and we did a science project up there actually, which was pretty fun. So to hear that it's become less touristy is kind of sad to me.
Well, the interesting part is there are some areas that they've essentially been regentrified. They push a lot of folks out. They've redone it. You mentioned Humboldt Park. If you go about 3 miles closer to Lake Michigan, there was an area there that was pretty run down. They revitalized it. So there is some revitalization going on. However, there's the crime in the area. Like if you look at Milwaukee, you really have to separate into two segments. You have the north side, you have the south side, and those segments and the crime seem to be expanding outward, which is causing a huge problem in the city alone. And unfortunately, it's affecting the suburbs. And so between that, the drug problem, the homeless problems, I mean, all the stuff that they're doing to try to better the city, and I'll give credit where credit's due, it's not enough to offset the negativity that's happening in the city. And so, but there are still wonderful parts of Milwaukee, don't get me wrong. I mean, you got Miller Park down there. You've got the east side is still interesting, Water Street. I mean, if you ever get back there, there's some restaurants I could take you to. I'm sure you'll dig them.
And I remember being on the water in Milwaukee, which was also pretty fun out there on a a regular boat. It was a nice time. But I got to ask you. So you mentioned all these problems that still linger in Milwaukee and other cities, drug problems and overdosing. I mean, when you talk about that, I think about how politicians have their hands in these big pharma pockets, and Democrats are not alone in that. Republicans aren't alone in that. Democrats are definitely in the pockets of big pharma, and I'm sure that's kind of why Milwaukee and other cities have deteriorated as well.
Well, I think, yeah, it definitely plays a role. I mean, we have one of the larger ones up here. We got Johnson Control, which is headquartered in Milwaukee. And there's another big one, and I can't remember the name of it offhand, that's just about 90 miles south of us, down in the Gurnee area, Waukegan area, North Chicago. And that's another big pharmaceutical company that's down there. So, I mean, that may certainly play a role in it, especially when it comes to prescription opioids and things like that. But thankfully, I mean, we've got up here in Wisconsin, we got Senator Ron Johnson, who's actually spearheading a lot of these issues when it comes to opioid abuse.
He is a stalwart. I love Ron Johnson. He's one of the next big senators. I mean, we've seen them come and go, but he's really making his mark now. And
right.
He held this thing with the CBP, and I just thought he did a great job with Mark Morgan. I don't know if you covered that at all, but I thought his testimony in Washington was great, and I thought Johnson did a great job. So let's say you got the week coming up. What else are you going to cover this week on the Caramel Conservative?
Oh, man, we got all kinds of stuff here, and I'm going to pull this up here because I got all kinds of entertaining things here. So basically, we run our show here about 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday nights. And, well, obviously, the elephant in the room we're going to be talking about is going to be the shooting. And I kind of did a little podcast last night, just a little 45-minute rant, and it was just that. And it was a little all over the place, and I'll admit to that, just simply because when you're trying to process this kind of thing, there's a lot of different angles you can come from. But I'm going to kind of surmise it a little bit more tomorrow night. I want to also talk about Laura Loomer.
Yeah.
She's an interesting one because the most banned woman on social media.
That's right, and she's running for Congress, if I'm not mistaken.
She is indeed running for Congress, and I kind of got mixed feelings about her, and I want to talk about that. And then, of course, you got the non-binary people. That apparently they're having an issue with trying to date people that don't want to accept the fact that they identify one way or another. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm sure AOC will show her heading up in here. So, yeah, we got a lot of good stuff coming up, and that's probably just going to be the first hour alone.
Now, do you have co-hosts, or how does your show work?
Well, occasionally I do have co-hosts. Sometimes my wife, Jen, she'll come on to the show there. We got a live call-in number, which I believe I have working at this particular point. It's taking me forever to get to it, but I think I got that set up. So, but there is a live chat room, so when we do it on Spreaker, the live chat's in there, so we actually do have a group of people that always pop up in there. So anybody that wants to join in, commentary, always welcome. So,
and if you want to find Caramel Conservative, Ed Delgado has been commenting on a lot of my podcasts as well, and I thank you for that little traction there because, when you post it, you want to know who's watching, who's listening, and I'm glad that you're tuning in, and I will definitely tune in more to your show. And it's great that it's live because I feel like that's the best way. I don't have the capability to do phone-in calls, or I would. I want to hear what society's thinking today because you get a whole bunch of people. You get left and right tuning in.
Well, and one of the things I love about doing the live show is that it catches all the errors, all the impromptu things that happen, and I want folks, from the left, from the right, anybody who's got commentary, because one of the things that, and I think I've heard you make comment about this before, and I thought this was a great comment, and it's like, we actually need to sit down and talk together, find out where our commonalities are. Now, the question I had in turn, of course, is, what are the things that we have in common? I think when we look at the national on the national level, what the leftists out there, the Antifa, the Black Lives Matters, if you're going to try to look for commonality there, you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it with the AOC crowds or the, Omars, Tlaibs, anyone like that. But for the average everyday person, this is where we're going to find the common ground. And I think it's got to start there. It's got to start with the conversation between individuals of the same belief. So in a certain way, you do have to preach to the choir.
Sure.
But it also has to get shared out to other folks, too, that maybe they don't want to chime in just yet, but eventually they will.
Well, let me ask you
to know that they're welcome in there.
Let me ask you this. How interesting is it when you see like a liberal hashtag and you have your viewpoint and you like interject your thoughts by using the hashtag most liberals are using in Twitter? I find that great because I find that's disrupting the conversation, saying, hey, other people like conservatives are using your hashtag to make their point too.
Oh, man, I used to do that all the time, and it is. I'm not going to lie. I love trolling liberals. I really do, because you like seeing them get all worked up, and it's funny because when they lose the argument, when they start resorting to racist, bigoted, privileged, things like that, and it totally detracts from whatever it was they were talking about.
And the irony is, and you're actually Hispanic. If you mentioned earlier, is that right?
Right. So, and then it cracks me up because ethnically, I'm half Mexican, half Puerto Rican, and I'm a full supporter of building a wall and reform immigration, all that good stuff. But I just can't help but sit and crack up when we're like, well, you're turning on your people. And my response has to be like, well, my people don't pay my bills.
Well, and I've had that same situation in that they say, well, how can you be okay with Trump mocking someone with disability? And I'm like, yeah, I have one leg, but I also am smart enough to know that he might not have been doing that. Also, Trump's Trump. And the biggest thing is, Ed, maybe you agree with me on this, every community is protected by the President of the United States. So whether you dislike him or not, your community will be protected if your president has your interests in mind. And he has everybody's interests in mind.
Well, and that's, if you take a look, and let's do a comparison between President Obama and President Trump. I was not a fan of President Obama. I knew when I was in North Carolina when Obama was elected. I knew a guy, his name was Ray, great guy. And he was elated when Obama was elected because he never thought he would see this day when a black man, half black man, even a quarter of a black man would have been elected to the presidency of the United States. And he had such high hopes. Now, I don't know whether he was disappointed or not in later years. I don't know, because I ended up moving about a year later. But you look at a lot of the statements from President Obama.
Sure.
He often would say things like, well, that's not who we are. But he wouldn't necessarily tell you who we were. He would say his off the cuff remarks that, the police acted ignorantly, or, if I had a son, he might look like Trayvon. He would jump to conclusions rather than trying to say, like President Trump did recently, we need to work together, unify. The president talks to people when he what was it he did with the LGBT month?
Right.
He acknowledged that. He's looking out for those folks. He's looking out for black unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, which is at record lows. He's looking for everybody's well-being because he's done well enough for himself. He doesn't need to worry about himself. He can actually go out there and do the right thing and do it free of any burden on himself.
And as far as disabled community, they say, well, these cuts are going to hurt us. But I ultimately believe that whenever he tries to make cuts with Medicaid or with certain things, in my community, I have a lot of friends there that are on Medicaid, but they're going to be okay because what he's trying to do is sift out the abuse that's going on with the Medicaid. That's what I'm trying to get through to these people.
Well, and there's so much abuse out there. Like, I know an individual who he's gaming the system. I mean, he has his own business and everything. However, he still claims, disability. And how is that necessarily fair against the individuals who truly have a disability? Like yourself, or I have a daughter who's autistic. She's high functioning autistic, and God willing, she'll be an independent functioning person eventually, but she's still autistic.
Right.
And I've often said, as a society, a civil society has a fiduciary duty to take care of those that cannot take care of themselves. It doesn't mean handhold them, though.
Right.
It means help them along the way. But in order to do that, we have to get those people that are leeching off the system out of the system.
That's right.
So that way we can provide better services to the people with Down, cerebral palsy, yourself, my daughter, whomever truly has those needs.
And you know what? We're in a liberal state here, and Cuomo cuts more to the disabled community than he wants to admit, and that has to be brought up as well. When Governor Cuomo says, why is Trump doing this with the disabled? Well, why are you and the media, why aren't you focused on the actual cuts that Cuomo's doing to the disabled community in New York? Like, how come no one's talking about that if we're so outraged at the treatment of disabled by Trump, which is fake outrage?
Well, and there's a lot of fake outrage out there, because if the media was actually honest about it, and being that you're in New York, I mean, yes, the headquarters of many, many large news conglomerates, why aren't more people talking about that? Because if they were, that would make national news. Just the cuts in New York alone. But rather than doing anything like that, it's just easier to show, the applause of, late-term abortions being passed, or driver's license to illegals. It's easier to show that than it is to actually show the shortcomings of your guy.
Yeah, and our guy wants to run for another 4 years, so please pray for us, Ed. Please pray for us. Now, I want to get to this other thing, if you have a moment, because your story is intriguing. You were a quote-unquote loony liberal in your 20s, but would you say serving for your country changed that mindset?
Surprisingly, no. It was an interesting thing, because So I joined the Marine Corps when I was 19. I got out when I was about 22 and a half. I busted my knee up. So I ended up getting out after that. And I got out in 95. So, nothing major going on or anything like that. As a matter of fact, I probably had one of the slickest jobs in the Corps. I was a admin clerk stationed in Hawaii. So, I can't, I wasn't John Rambo by any means, and I had it pretty sweet. I can't complain about that. Now, that being said, I come back and I join the real world. Anytime you have to come from being in a military structured environment to living in the civilian world, there is a bit of adjustment, because now all of a sudden you're responsible for your own, housing, electricity, your bills, all that other stuff. Nobody is there. There's no safety net. So as things have kind of progressed, I'm starting to make a little bit more money. I'm getting promotion at work. And all of a sudden I'm realizing, my God, I'm not getting a tax refund this year. I'm actually paying one out. But that wasn't the breaking point. So right around the time of the Lewinsky scandal,
Sure.
if you remember President Clinton, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Look dead at the camera. Now, one of the things about Bill Clinton was that he was a phenomenal communicator. So when he talked to you, you almost felt like he was talking to you.
Yep.
He was a type of guy you wouldn't mind having a beer with, having a whiskey and Coke with. And when things started to really unravel, it's when I started questioning a lot of things. So at that point, I started picking up every book I could possibly read. Every book historically, every book on economics, every book, just historically, anything I could read, Plato, Socrates, the Federal Papers, you name it. So I started reading this, and I thought to myself, you know what, okay, I need to listen to somebody else in order to kind of see what their thought process was. So I started listening to Rush Limbaugh.
Okay, yeah, and he rose to prominence at that time.
Right. So the more I started listening, the more I started reading, the more I started trying to educate myself a little bit more outside of the collegiate system and everything else. The more I started putting things together, and I was like, you know what, this idea of being dependent, waiting on somebody else to take care of me, no, that's there's no work ethic in there. There's no pride. You know, there's a saying that I love, that something given has no value. If the government's going to give me anything, how am I going to value it?
Right.
Whereas if I work my tail off, if I try to provide the best that I can for my family with the God-given abilities that I have, well, you know what? I'm probably going to be more prone to take care of it. And it's just kind of over the years, it's kind of grown to the point where I know what I believe, because now at this point in my life, it's been time tested. And now I want to get that message out to other people and also hear what they have to say, because my ideas have to be worth challenge. Because of and I think that's one of the big differences between a lot of people on the left versus the right. We want our ideas challenged, because if our ideas aren't worth being challenged, they're not worth having. So challenge me, and if I'm wrong, then I'm going to learn from you. If I'm right, then you've reaffirmed what I know already. Whereas those on the left, when challenged, it's pick your pejorative.
Right.
You know, you're the race, you're the bigot, you're whatever. You know, so it kind of, and I still see this as an ongoing journey, because if you're not learning every day, then you're doing something wrong.
It's a good point. In life, at work, anything. Now, what do you do for work, if you don't mind me asking, along with the podcast?
Well, work-wise, I actually try to keep that very separate from the two, just because, I mean, I work in sales, so I'll say that much, but I do keep the two very, very separate from one another, just because I know there's a lot of people that I have that they run both sides of the political spectrum. So, you know, during the workday, I try to keep that as separate as possible, but, yeah, so I keep myself in sales and get to spend a lot of time on the road there, going from point A to point B.
Well, that's good. And obviously, when you have something creative like a podcast, it keeps your mind going with other things as well. And this is what keeps me going in life, is to do something like this keeps me going on the day job too. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's funny too, because for me, I have 3 children, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast too was because we all need to find a reason for what it is that we do. And my 2 older children, they live in California. My youngest lives with me. And whenever I see them, whenever I talk to them, it doesn't matter how tired I am, how worn out I am, what's going on, but just looking at them makes me want to push a little bit harder, go a little bit further, and reach down for that inner strength that I didn't think I had at that moment, and to leave a better world than what I have. And the world that I have isn't too bad. But if I can leave something better, if that is my legacy to my children, to provide some type of message out there, to instill in them the values that have made our country the greatest force for good that this planet has ever seen, to give them that knowledge, whether it's through our normal daily interaction or through the form of a podcast, then I will have at least been proud of just doing that alone.
Well, Ed, you've got a lot to be proud of every day when you do, every Tuesday when you do this podcast. And of course, check them out, The Caramel Conservative. Where are you on Twitter? Where are you on the social sphere?
On Twitter, I am on, at Mr. Ed 1776. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at The Caramel Conservative. And then, of course, there's the website, thecaramelconservative.com.
Very cool. And by the way, we met on Convo, and that's kind of how the Convo started, right?
Yes.
And
and it was...
Go for it. No, go for it. I love Convo, by the way, just to throw that in there.
Well, and I'm really excited about it because right now the site is down, but they're actually working on doing a couple upgrades to get live chat going on. So I think that's going to be phenomenal. But yeah, when I saw your podcast on there and I had to get a chance to listen to a few episodes, and I'm like, okay, this is good. This is good. I got to listen to more of this here. And just kind of, I think, over the past week or so, we kind of talked a little bit more. And yeah, and that's one of the beauties I love about podcasting is the community that it creates, too, because there's several other people that I know from Iowa, Texas, Massachusetts, Illinois, and I've made some very, very good friendships with these folks. So I'm definitely, looking forward to this and all our future endeavors.
And hopefully, maybe, God willing, we can all be on the same stage doing a podcast. That would be an incredible experience. Maybe, if things work out.
That would, and then I'm definitely looking forward to trying to do something like that. It's just a matter of putting the ideas together.
All right, Ed. Well, I'll be there to help you, and I will definitely have you back on Keeping It with Alexander Garrett. Ed of the Caramel Conservative, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, sir, and I'll definitely be in touch with you.
Absolutely. I'm Alexander Garrett, keeping it real. Stay tuned for more. Hey, thanks so much, Ed.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. Hopefully I can have you on my show.